every major greatsword type in history, before firearms changed warfare forever, before cannons, before muskets, before gunpowder reached Europe, there existed a class of weapons so massive, so terrifying, that only the strongest, most elite soldiers on the battlefield were trusted to carry one. Not a sword you wore on your hip, a sword you carried on your shoulder, the Great Sword, used across centuries and continents, from feudal Japan to medieval Germany to the Highlands of Scotland. These weapons weren't blunt instruments of brute force. They were precision tools, designed with sophisticated geometry, wielded with dedicated fighting systems, and feared by everyone who faced one. Today, we're going through every major greatsword type in history, where they came from, what made each one unique, and why they dominated their era. Let's start at the beginning. Before we get to the giants, we need to talk about the weapon that started it all, the longsword. Emerging across Europe between the 13th and 17th centuries, the longsword was the Swiss army knife of medieval warfare, typically measuring 40 to 48 inches in total length. With a grip long enough for two hands, it sat right on the boundary between one-handed and two-handed use. And that flexibility was the point. Longswords were designed for the Kunst des Fechtens, the German art of fighting. Practitioners used the blade, the crossguard, and even the pommel as striking tools. This was called Mordhau, literally murder stroke, where a knight would grab the blade and use the hilt like a hammer to punch through armor. The long sword wasn't just a cutting weapon, it was a wrestling tool, a thrusting weapon, a half-swording precision instrument. It's the ancestor of every true greatsword that came after it. Understanding the longsword means understanding why everything else on this list was built the way it was. Now we scale up dramatically. The Zweihänder, German for two-hander. And if you think that sounds straightforward, wait until you see one in person. These weapons were developed in Germany and the Swiss Confederacy during the 15th and 16th centuries. Total length, anywhere from 60 to 72 inches. That's up to 6 feet of sharpened steel. Weight typically ranged from 6 to 14 pounds, though many fighting examples were closer to the lower end than Hollywood would have you believe. The Zweihänder wasn't standard infantry issue, it was carried by a specialized class of German mercenary soldiers called Doppelsöldner, double-pay soldiers. They earned twice the standard wage because their job was specifically to charge into enemy pike formations, swing the massive blade in wide arcs, and literally cut the pikes down before the main infantry clashed. That's not a job for the faint of heart. The blade featured a distinctive design, a ricasso, a deliberately unsharpened section near the base of the blade that allowed the user to half-sword the weapon, essentially using it as a short spear or lever in close quarters. Many Zweihänders also featured a secondary crossguard called the Parierhaken, parrying hooks, positioned at the ricasso to stop incoming blade strikes. This was engineering in the service of violence, precise, deliberate, battlefield-tested engineering. Across the Channel and into the Scottish Highlands, a different culture, a different enemy, a different solution, the Scottish claymore. The name comes from the Gaelic Claidheim Mór, great sword, and it earned that name. Developed primarily in the 15th and 16th centuries, the true claymore, not to be confused with the later basket-hilted broadsword that often gets called a claymore today, was a massive two-handed weapon with a distinctive feature. Its cross-guard angled sharply forward toward the blade, ending in quatrefoil terminals, small, clover-shaped decorations that were as functional as they were beautiful. Those angled coulons, they were designed to catch and trap enemy blades. The claymore typically ran 55 to 60 inches in total length, with a broad, double-edged blade optimized for powerful cutting strokes. In the dense, close-quarters fighting of Highland warfare, where terrain was rough, formations were loose, and the goal was often shock and psychological impact, the claymore was perfectly suited. Highland warriors used it to smash through shields, unhorse cavalry, and break enemy formation morale in those critical first seconds of engagement. It was an intimidation weapon as much as a killing weapon, and it worked on both counts. History didn't produce giant swords only in Europe. Half a world away, Japanese swordsmiths arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion, though through an entirely different tradition, the odachi, sometimes called the nodachi field sword. These were the Japanese greatswords, and they are extraordinary objects. Blades alone could reach 36 inches or more. Some ceremonial examples exceeded 6 feet in total length. They were forged using the same Tamahagane steel folding process as the katana, which means extraordinary sharpness and differential hardness along the blade. But unlike the katana's signature single-handed use, the odachi demanded both hands and significant physical strength just to draw. In fact, drawing an odachi from a scabbard was its own dedicated art. Because the blade was too long to draw from the hip, warriors either had an attendant draw it for them, drew it from a back-mounted scabbard with a two-handed technique, or simply carried it unsheathed. On the battlefield, the odachi was primarily used by mounted samurai, where the height advantage of horseback gave the length of the blade a tactical purpose, cutting down infantry or opposing cavalry in wide, powerful arcs. The odachi represents something fascinating, an independent cultural parallel to the European greatsword tradition. Two civilizations, no direct contact, same tactical conclusion, back to Europe. And one of the most visually striking greatsword variations ever produced, the flamberge. Named from the French for flame, the flamberge featured a dramatically undulating, wave-shaped blade. And it wasn't just for show. Developed during the 16th century, primarily in Germany and France, the flamberge was the greatsword of the dueling era. Its wavy blade served two documented mechanical purposes. First, it caused an opponent's blade to vibrate upon contact, transmitting uncomfortable, disorienting feedback up the arm. Second, the wavy edge created more friction and drag when passing through flesh, increasing wound severity. The flamberge was deeply controversial. Some historical accounts suggest it was considered a dishonorable weapon, too cruel, too unsportsmanlike. Whether that reputation was accurate or exaggerated, it speaks to just how effective the design was perceived to be. Flambergs were used both as battlefield weapons and as ceremonial or dueling swords by Swiss and German mercenary officers. If you've ever seen a Swiss papal guard at the Vatican, they still carry ceremonial flamberge-style weapons today, a 500-year-old tradition frozen in time. Portugal and Spain produced their own distinctive greatsword tradition, and it comes with one of the most sophisticated documented fighting systems of any weapon on this list. The montante, developed and used across the Iberian Peninsula from the 15th through the 17th centuries. The montante was a massive two-handed sword, comparable in size to the Zweihander, but with a distinct use case and a uniquely preserved training curriculum. Portuguese and Spanish military manuals, particularly those of Diogo Gomes de Figueiredo from the early 17th century, lay out in extraordinary detail how the montante was used. And the answer is surprising. It was primarily a crowd control weapon. A soldier armed with a montante would guard a key position, a doorway, a ship's gangplank, a narrow pass, and keep multiple attackers at bay using a continuous flow of wide, sweeping cuts and thrusts designed to maintain distance and control space. The montante practitioner wasn't trying to fight one-on-one. He was buying time, creating zones of danger, protecting flanks. It was essentially the original area denial weapon. Two more regional variations worth understanding, because they show how the greatsword concept adapted to different national fighting traditions. The espadon, from the French word for broadsword, was the French version of the large two-handed sword, typically featuring a slightly narrower, more thrust-oriented blade than the German Zweihander. It reflected French fencing culture's growing emphasis on the point over the edge. Meanwhile, Italian masters were developing the spadone, their own two-handed tradition, documented extensively in masters like Filippo Vadi and Pietro Monte. The Italian system emphasized fluid transitions between cuts and thrusts, exploiting the full length of the blade with what they called mezza spada, half-sword techniques, as part of a seamlessly integrated fighting method. What's remarkable is that while Germany, France, Italy, and Spain all produced their own versions of the greatsword, the core tactical principles were convergent. Control space, use leverage, exploit reach, transition fluidly between range zones. Great minds, in different languages, thinking alike. Not all greatswords were battlefield weapons. Some were designed for a single, specific, grim purpose. The execution sword, known in German as the Richtschwert, or Scharfrichtschwert, was a specialized large two-handed sword used exclusively for judicial executions by beheading, primarily in German-speaking Europe from the 16th through the 18th centuries. These swords were distinct in design, a broad, heavy, rounded, or blunt tip, because thrusting was never the intent, paired with a wide, powerful blade optimized for a clean, single stroke. Many were elaborately decorated, inscribed with Latin phrases about justice, law, and divine authority. Execution swords were professional tools. Executioners trained with them. Their quality was a reflection of civic pride. A botched execution was a public embarrassment for the entire town. They represent the final, sobering evolution of the Greatsword concept, removed from the chaos of battle, reduced to a single controlled act, carrying the full weight of law and mortality in one stroke. The Greatsword didn't die when firearms took over the battlefield. It transformed. It became ceremonial. It became sport. It became art. It became the obsession of historians, collectors, and modern practitioners who have spent decades reconstructing the exact fighting systems these weapons were built for. What's remarkable, looking across every type on this list, is the consistency of human ingenuity. From Scottish highlands to Japanese rice fields, from Portuguese harbor defenses to German mercenary pike breaks, people kept arriving at the same fundamental insight. Sometimes you need a longer blade, stronger arms, and a willingness to train harder than everyone else on the field. The great sword was never the weapon of the common soldier. It was always the weapon of the specialist, the dedicated, the dangerous, and the elite. And if history teaches us anything, it's that those people have always been worth remembering. If you want to go deeper on any of these, the fighting manuals, the metallurgy, the historical battles, let me know in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. There's a lot more of this coming.